The ship from Astapor rolled like a patient beast in the scrubbed light before dawn, and Missandei stood at the prow with her hands on the rail, and named the colors of the sea in every tongue she knew. In Old Kiskari, the water was Cathosh, iron gray. In the clipped merchant's Valyrian of the narrow sea, it was Drabos, the color of unworked wool. In the common tongue of Westeros, it was simply gray, but that did not catch the way the light braided itself through slick valleys of swell, nor the sheen along the back of each wave like a blade, that if you were careless, could turn and cut you. She whispered the words anyway, and the wind slurred them from her mouth and carried them to shore. The shore itself presented as a low black smudge, growing fanged with masts as the galley came in. Above the masts rose a city like a tangle of brick and smoke, the old domes and new towers jutting out of one another at clumsy angles. On her tongue, King's Landing tasted of salt, tar, and something sweet she could not name, as if a sugar barrel had burst somewhere on a quay. She had read the names of its streets to herself in the nights between Astapor and here. Street of Flower, Street of Steel, Street of Sisters. A city of streets that tried to remember what they were before they were bent into service by kings. Behind her, the deck creaked with the soft footfalls of Unsullied posted in ceremonial half-armor, the blue dye of Astapor's clay washed out by salt and sun to a dusty hue. Their shadows long to her left. Missandei glanced once at the nearest eunuch, and found him watching the horizon with his wrapped spear couched at an angle that pleased her eye. Half-armor and wrapped spear were part of the message. This was not an army making landfall, only an embassy with its honor guard. A ribboned spear rather than a bared blade. A priest of the bearded priests might have chosen brighter ribbons. Missandei had chosen plain ones. Kings squinted at bright things and missed what the plain hid. She turned from the rail and let the city grow at her back a moment, closing her eyes to find the islands of Neath as she had long learned to do. Wings whispering like leaves, the warm musk of fruit split by thumbs, her brother's laughter braided with the sea's open hand. She took a single breath of Neath and then let the smell be washed away by pitch and fish and rope and smoke. Her mind had trained itself to do this long ago. Keep a word of home folded behind the teeth, but let the air be the place where your feet were. There would be many words said today, and her tongue would have to be the shore onto which two seas broke and mingled without drowning one another. Land, came the strong-voiced call from the bow watch. Unnecessary, but a ritual that men liked. The oars dipped in, rose, dipped again. Missandei's stomach tightened, not with fear but with an old memory of hunger that always came when ships glided into harbors at dawn. As a child, she had watched slavers' galleys glide into Astapor, and that same hush had fallen over the piers. Hush had meant the buyers were sharpening their eyes. Hush had meant you belonged to someone else. Now hush meant poise, meant the sentence she had been drafting in her head all night had to be uttered without tremor, meant the words she had set down on parchment in overlapping scripts must become breath. She had not brought Daenerys' name with her, except in the part of the sentence needful for truth. Missandei came from Astapor, from the council that had replaced the good masters. She had sailed under a flag sewn of plain linen with a crude brick painted in ochre, at its center to say, "This, we are made of this, what we had has cracked and been remade." It was more honest than a dragon. It let the city on the hill take breath without thinking it was already on fire. She held herself straight and smoothed the linen of her dress as the ship bumped at last against a rubbing post. A friendly shove of wood against wood that told a story of arrival without ceremony. The gangplank rattled down. The harbor moved forward as if taking the ship in its arms. At first, King's Landing was a drone of voices and a smell. The smell sat heavy as a hand on the back of her head. Rotting fish sweetness, ripe fruit, pig dung, tallow, smoke. A line of alkali running through it like chalk. The voices were a different sort of press, many pitched to sell and be heard over the water's slap. She recognized Bravosi over there, thin and quick, and the mangled common of a Pentoshi, whose mouth could not find the RES, and a hard-lipped Myrish, whose vowels were squares. And everywhere, the Westerosi common tongue in its variations. A dockman's rasp, a boy's crack, a woman's call with beginnings of song in it. Apples fresh, The words clipped by accent to app fresh. Gold cloaks waited at the foot of the gangplank, breastplates dull with use, hair sweat pasted to foreheads. They did not look at the Unsullied for long, which was wise. Missandei stepped down before any of her guard could, the sun laying a thin line across her shoulder. Tall compared to most women here. Small compared to most men. She let her stride be unhurried. From a pouch at her side, she drew the thin stick of whitewood that stood as her staff of office, its top wrapped with that same plain ribbon, the sign that opened gates and closed in other places. She spoke first, because it was best to go forward and not be measured in silence. In the name of Astapor's free council, and on behalf of the brick that we have remade, I come as Missandei of Neath, she said in unembroidered common, letting vowels spin out into the air as if they were seeds. The head of the gold cloak squinted once, and then back at her, and something worked behind his eyes like a man doing an addition in his head. Perhaps he had expected a man old enough to be a father. Perhaps he had expected a mouth with harsher words in it. "Your papers?" he said. A man's voice that wished to be bored and so be safe, but could not quite manage it. Missandei handed over a scroll with seals of wax that had sweated in the heat, and a narrow slate stamped with a bird for ravens carried from site to site. The gold cloak took them. He did not break the wax. He turned to the man at his left, who had a coal-black, ink-scorched fingertip, and a satchel overflowed with rolled skins. Papers found papers. The two men murmured. The word, Astapor, passed between their mouths like a piece of hard fruit in danger of being dropped. A new sound came, light and clean as a bell made of silk. "My friends," said that sound friendly, a little amused, and Missandei turned to find its owner. He was fat in a way that suggested softness without laziness, his eyes dark and kind, his hands ringed but the rings simple. Varys wore pomegranate-colored silk that made his face look more careful than it was. He did not smell of perfume, and Missandei liked that, for she had learned that perfumes were a way to push your scent in front of someone's mind. "Lord Varys," said the gold cloak, and tried to stand straighter. Varys's smile moved from man to man with a sort of gentle curiosity, as if he would have been content to ask each of them what they had eaten for breakfast. "And Missandei of Neath, is it?" said Varys, and in the syllables of her name she heard the work of a tongue trained to move lightly through the shapes of other tongues. "On behalf of the Free Council of Astapor?" The pause was deliberate, a finger placed on a map to say, "Here is a thing we will have to talk about. Welcome to King's Landing. I pray your voyage was merciful. Merciful and long, and the last is not in your power to change," Missandei said. And a little smile from Varys told her that the talk would be easier than the harbor. "We come with documents for the king and the small council." "In that case," said Varys, "the quay is no place to stand. We have chairs on the hill and cups and windows with breeze. I will accompany you." They moved through the streets like a needle through wool. The Unsullied walked 3 by 3, their spears angled up and away from faces, careful not to nick the banners that drooped out of windows, or the cages of songbirds hung to catch a bit of sun. Children kept pace for a few yards at a time before getting bored or frightened. Once, at the corner of a market where eels twisted in shallow baskets, a woman lifted her chin and spit toward the Unsullied's feet. But the spit was just spit and not a curse, and no one gathered behind it. Missandei watched the way the city looked at her. Curiosity, a little fear, a touch of hunger that belonged to the eyes and not the gut. "Your common is beautiful," Varys murmured as they climbed a narrow lane that let the smell of the Blackwater Bay fade and the smell of bread rise. "There is a softness to the Missandei way with S and L which I admit I miss hearing. It does not diminish the teeth of a word, but it suggests there might be sweetness in it if a listener brought sweetness with him. Now, 8 times sweetness is the thing men have forgotten how to carry," Missandei said, and Varys's mouth ticked at one corner. "Astapor streets were brittle when we left. Men had learned so long to bow at one door that they do not yet know to sit together at a table." "Ah," said Varys. "Well, we in King's Landing have long known how to sit together at a table. Eating is another matter. Damn. The red keep rose like a hand of brick and white stone that had dragged itself out of the hill by the fingers. Up close, it was less a single thing than a set of decisions made over generations, each with its own logic and its own stubbornness. They were taken through a gate that took their names and pressed them into the memory of men with good boots, through a yard where boys hacked at one another with blunted swords and their instructors hawked thickly, past a window where a woman's arm in a velvet sleeve lay like a pale fish on sill, and at last into a passage tiled with green, cool underfoot, even through the soles of her sand. Missandei let the passage take some of her heat. She noted the faces of men who did not announce their attention but wore it in their shoulders. She measured the way sound traveled here, and that there would be a place across the hall where one could listen to a conversation and think oneself not seen. Before the small council, Varys said softly, "There are courtesies. Lady Margaery is at her prayers in the sept. The Queen Regent may be with the king or not. Lord Tywin is best thought of as with his ledgers." "Ledgers," Missandei said, letting the S splay a little so she could place it properly later. "Numbers are their own sort of sword," Varys replied. "One cuts in front, one behind." Missandei smiled. "We shall see if the scabbards fit." The chamber of the small council had a long table with scars from knives and wine cups that had warmed for too long. The chairs were not equal. Tywin Lannister's chair had taller sides and a higher back, and that was a statement more naked than Missandei would have expected from a man so practiced at understatement. Varys entered without knocking. A scribe looked up from a band of notes and blinked. Missandei paused just inside the arch, far enough that she could not be easily surprised from behind, near enough to be summoned without having to cross the room like a penitent. Tywin sat with his red hands folded on the table and looking not at all red. In the flesh, he was less gold lion than carver of lions, a man made of hard wood, not jewels. Cersei sat a chair down, her hair arranged to the privilege of a queen, and her gaze like a shutter that a wind kept lifting and slamming shut. Pycelle drifted at the far end like a winter fly. Lord Baelish leaned on the back of his chair with a familiarity that might have been a habit or a decision for her benefit. The king was not here. Missandei let her shoulders relax the tiniest degree. "Your grace is elsewhere," Varys said, as if in answer to a thought he was too polite to name. He has a fondness for hounds he insists must be indulged. So often young kings find obedience easier when it comes on four legs. "Then, let us not waste ourselves on chatter," said Tywin without looking at anyone in particular. And the room turned to face that voice as a field of barley will turn when the wind decides to be directions. "Missandei of Eneath, Astapor sends you." "Astapor sends documents and words, my lord," said Missandei, and folded into the chair indicated for her, one with arms, which was a grace, but a low back, which was a test. She placed the scrolls on the table. "I come with both." Lord Baelish's smile was a pattern cut into water. "I've always liked that. Words as something brought. Most people treat them as something that comes of itself, like sweat." "Words bring more words," Missandei replied, and looked at Tywin. "The Free Council of Astapor, having rid itself of the trade that made it rich, cannot feed itself on its pride. The good brick was smashed and has been made again into a smaller thing. Smaller things stand more surely if they are joined. We propose a treaty of recognition and trade with King's Landing. In brief, a pledge from each to recognize the other's laws over its own citizens within their own harbors. A pact to return Westermen taken and sold into slavery in Essos as they are found, and likewise to return any men of Astapor who flee here bound by debts signed before the freeing. An equal easing of tariffs for goods moved between our ports. A promise not to harbor agents paid by Yunki or Marine, while the free cities decide their. If the king will put his hand to such things, then the council will put its hands to grain from the shorelands and to certain ores still within our hills. There are further articles as to quarrels, and they're putting an end. But that is the frame." "Nendo." The room did not breathe for a number of heartbeats that might have been counted. Cersei's mouth twisted in something like a smile, and then untwisted. Pycelle plucked at the chain around his neck, as if to remind himself of the length of his breath. You would have us recognize this? Free council, Tywin said, without looking at the scrolls. A band of men who took a city because a Targaryen girl told them to, and sold its masters to the gutter. You offer grain? Not only, Missandei said, and let her voice be the steady thing on which a tray of cups might be borne. Astapor offers quiet. It offers a law that will not snatch a Westerman from a dockside and find his price over a table in a back room. It offers an end to the hiring of certain ships to take on certain cargoes whose payment has sometimes reached men in this city, whose names I need not say. It offers a port where your traders may settle accounts without finding themselves counted. She turned her palm up as if yielding something small. And yes, grain. Your ships cannot carry much grain, said Baelish mildly. Your harbor is not yet a harbor. I have a fondness for houses that sell themselves as tall when they are taller only because they stand on flatter ground. Lord Baelish, Varys murmured. Missandei has made a miracle of plain linen. It may be we should ask what thread she spun it from, rather than remark on the lack of gold. Plain thread holds, said Missandei. Astapor has merchants. Many are without masters for the first time, and look about with fear for their own hands. Their fear may be turned into something useful if you offer them a dock and a price they can count on. If you refuse them that, their fear will be turned by Yunkai, which knows how to buy fear, and has done so for a long time. And Mirain is watching for whichever hand raises first, to take it, or to strike it. Pycelle wheezed once as if in a sudden laugh. Oh, the child knows Essos. I know men, Missandei said. And ledgers. Tywin's fingers moved at last, as if a thought had found an end in them. In return then for the king's recognition of your counsel and his silence as to certain recent irregularities, you offer to return any Westerman found in your city enslaved. He did not look at Varys, but the air in the room moved in the shape of a glance. You will also return any Westerman not enslaved but held for debt or in the guise of contracts of indenture. And you will recognize the right of the king's agents to go and search for such persons within your walls. Then, you would send gold cloaks into Astapor, Cersei said, a bright edge of cruelty in the thought. We have no gold cloaks, Missandei said, and found her mouth smiling. And contracts of indenture we have unknotted as best we can. Many of those threads may not be found again. As to searches, Astapor is not as large as this city. A certain number of places will be closed. A certain number will be opened. You may ask, and we may answer. We may also ask. She placed 2 fingers gently on the scroll's seal. And there is a matter of clause 5. Varys' eyes warmed. He had read. Tywin had not. Missandei took no pleasure. She had known which kind of man Tywin Lannister would be. She broke the seal with her fingernail, unrolled the parchment in a single soft pull, and turned it so that the council could see the shape of the words. The common tongue had been written first, but the letters had a slight tilt where the Valyrian behind them had pushed up like new shoots. Clause 5, she said. Each party will pledge not to harbor claimants to the Uther's seats, not kings, not would-be councils, not men in exile who write to be welcomed with knives. If there is to be peace, it cannot be made while men write to their own shadows. Cersei's mouth flattened. Tywin's eyes moved for the first time, as if they had found a pebble in the boot that had to be either shaken out or worked around. Littlefinger's smile stopped moving for the time it took to set one coin on another. You would ask us, Tywin said, to pledge not to harbor pretenders to the power of Astapor. And in return, you pledge not to harbor pretenders to the Iron Throne. Mensau, we ask that each city be allowed to put a lock on its own door and believe that a neighbor will not hide its thieves, Missandei said. She watched Varys for the length of half a breath, and saw whatever he had hoped to hide darken the shade of his eyes. We are far from you. It should not tax your strength or your honor to say this much. Unless there is honor in the harboring. I suppose the old king's hand had a proverb for this, Littlefinger murmured, and no one looked at him. Tywin's mouth folded over a thought and turned it. When he spoke, his voice wore no adornment. You are not an ambassador from a recognized state, and so in truth, this is not a treaty but a proposal for an understanding. We understand that you wish our coin and our word. We understand that you offer in return a promise to be less troublesome than we might otherwise expect. We understand you have brought the matter of pretenders with you, as if we would be startled by it. We are not." His fingers tapped one another once. "We will not pledge not to harbor men who have done nothing but speak. We will pledge that we will not arm men against you while calling them friends." The sentence had the shape of fairness and the taste of fog. Missandei inclined her head. "An unarmed man can be guided to a ship, if he is to be put on a ship at all. Some men put themselves on ships," said Circe. "A few women too. One hears stories." "Stories," Missandei said softly, "are always sharper in the mouth than in the hand." Varys exhaled as if to tidy the air. "If I may," he said, "there is a practical point that could be made to make the noble Lord Hand's ledger thicker with names of goods to be exchanged. Astapor has certain crafts. Unsullied who stand all day with spears must learn, of a sudden, to hold plows. Women who have known only how to keep order in the halls of masters must learn what it is to take coin and give it back. Meanwhile, King's Landing is a pot with the lid off. We have more mouths than we have measures of grain. If there were an understanding that allowed men who sailed with goods from here to settle accounts more, what is the word gently, then I suspect merchants who now avoid your docks would be willing to try them. Then, we have placed guards at our wayhouses who cannot be bribed," Missandei said. "That is not a threat. It is meant to allure a certain sort of man. We will also allow your men to bring your own scales so they may go home and say, 'I saw the weight myself with these eyes.' These are methods of building trust among men who do not speak law as their first language." "Then, ha!" said Pycelle too loudly. And an attendant who had been doing a good job of not being seen flinched. "Very well. We will build trust as if we were children stacking blocks." "Better blocks than swords," said Varys, but his eyes were on Tywin. Tywin took up the scroll at last and unrolled it just enough to press his thumbs over the ink. Missandei saw his pupils flicker not like a reader, but like a man who counts the leaves on a tree to guess how much fruit it might bear. He stopped when he reached the clause about the right of return. "Explain this." "The Free Council," Missandei said, "acknowledges the right of Westermen who can prove they were taken from the Seven Kingdoms to return to their homes, regardless of any contracts signed after their taking, and regardless of the coin paid for them, which coin shall be sought from the men who bought them rather than the men who owned them." She kept her face calm. She thought of the names in the little ledger folded into her sleeve, the fine sharp strokes of her script. Halder, son of Halder, from the windy hill near the stony sept. Jane Cobb, a needlewoman from Lannisport. Ben Butterwell, from a village whose name he had forgotten but that he remembered had a tree that split like a wishbone. 3 names she had picked from a dozen 3 stories that could be weighed in a room like this. The complicating line under the last seen in Yunkai. "And you have the men to find them," Tywin said dryly. "You will return them across a sea, from cities where they are held in hidden places by men who are not at present your friends." "We have men whose ears are good," Missandei said, and did not look at Varys. "We have coin that can be spent on information rather than chains. If we spend it so, we will find enough to show that the seal at the bottom of this parchment meant something." Tywin's eyes did not soften, but they cooled, as if a red iron had been turned in air. "Enough. Enough," Missandei said. The talk went on. It braided small specifics to the larger rope. It wound through the matter of pilots for the Blackwater's mouth, and the duties of men who stood at ramparts and pointed to sandbars for coin. It wound down to the little detail that was not little, the place where Astapor's ships would tie up and whether the gold cloaks would patrol near their moorings, or a little farther down the quay. Tywin argued for farther. Missandei argued for nearer. Littlefinger called it a juicy question, and made a joke about the price of rope that piped badly with Cersei's temper, and brought her to her feet with a heat that made the room smaller. Missandei did not stand. She was a fixed point in a room of men, and one woman who were not used to being asked to move. By the end, the parchment had been copied once, and then copied again to include the adjustments, and Tywin had said, We will show this to the king, in the tone of a man who thinks he is referring to a boy. You should eat, Varys said to Missandei as the room emptied and the smudges of ink began to set. It has been a morning without food and an afternoon that will not spare you for it. I would see the dock before we eat, Missandei said. I would see the rope they will give us at our moorings and count the boards of the quay. Then I will eat. Varys's smile had a weariness in it that made Missandei's chest feel warm for an instant. With pity she did not permit to show on her face. Come, he said. I know a place where the bread is less stale than most bread, and the butter has not been warmed and chilled so many times that it has forgotten what it is. They descended into the city again, the red keep giving them up with the same grudging clatter with which it had taken them, and the streets threw their arms about them. Voices, heat, a clog of flies around 2 slabs of meat laid out on a butcher's table, a man with a tray of brass trinkets stamped with stags or lions. The river flashed through the gap at the end of the street of silk, green where the sun got caught in it. Missandei paused long enough to watch the upstream side of the new boom that guarded against ships like the one Stannis had once sailed. Men in boats rowed to and fro, and on the boom itself, men walked as if on a floating wall. The city, in that thing, had learned a language of ropes and pulleys that belonged more to the world out of which she had come than to the history of its kings, and Missandei filed that away for later use. They had reached the turn toward the dockside when a girl, no, a young woman, small and hard as if someone had squeezed the child out of her and left only bone and will, stepped out from a doorway and took Missandei by the sleeve. Not roughly, not like a beggar. She stood there with her hand on Missandei's linen and looked up into Missandei's face and said, in a common scraped by long disuse, "My sister." Missandei did not pull her arm back. The Unsullied flowed forward like shade becoming a wall, and then stopped with their spears angled a fraction out and up to say, "We are here, but we do not wish to be a story." Varys held up one plump hand without looking at the spearmen. He did not look at Missandei either. He looked at the girl, and he did it with a simplicity that told Missandei he had known she would be arriving, and had chosen not to warn Missandei. "What is your sister's name?" Missandei asked, because names caught breath and made it useful. "Ganna," the girl said. Then, as if that were not enough, and it was not, Ganna Cobb. "We were at the wharf that day, and the men took us, and I jumped into the river, and I am a little fish." "She is not a fish, she is an Astapor," a man said. A man said he knew. He said a ship needed small fingers to pick out the dried hearts for the falcons, and Ganna has small fingers. The girl's face was a map with roads scribbled on it by many hands. She had not wept in some time but had not quit the habit entirely, and so a tear made itself without much effort and stuck in the corner of her eye, choosing not to fall. "You said," the girl said, "and this made it into a liturgy. You said in your paper you would send them home if you found them." Missandei waited long enough to feel her own breath. The time for ceremony had been earlier. Now was the time for a thing done, or left undone. "Where do you sleep?" she asked. The girl gave a place, an alley with a door painted red, and a number of steps to count from a tavern that had lost a letter from its sign. Missandei did not know the tavern, but Varys did. He said, "Matter of fact. She tells the truth, as if truth were a mug on a table there for anyone to pick up. There are men we could ask if you think it wise. There are men we must not, if you think it wiser." Missandei looked down at the girl's hand on her sleeve and put her own hand over it. It was a small enough thing, that touch, but it made the two of them into something that could not be easily cut apart by words. "Ganna Cobb," she said, as if she were writing the name under the other names in her hidden ledger. "I cannot promise a ship can cross the sea in an afternoon, but I promise that before I sleep tonight, a letter will go out with your sister's name on it, in a place where letters are read by the men now in charge, and one of those men will understand that it matters to me, and so it will matter to him. Come to the door you spoke of at moonrise. We will write and send the letter, and you will watch it be sealed, and you will see it given to a man who handles ravens with clean hands." She placed the girl's fingers gently back at her side and did not pretend this was simple. "And if the letter is not enough, We will do something less pretty. Do you understand? Menagasawan. The girl's shoulders sagged in something that was relief, and something that was weariness surfacing after too long under. Yes, she said. I do. She opened her mouth to say more and shut it, and went back into the doorway she had come from, which was the wisest thing she could have done. And Missandei felt a measure of respect fold itself into this morning, like an extra thread in a hem. Varys exhaled that breath he made when compelled to adjust his plans. The city keeps accounts of injuries as much as coin, he said softly. It is good to pay something into the right column. It is good to be the sort of woman who can be used to pay such a thing, Missandei said, and made herself smile to make it something like a jest. She let her gaze find the water again to bring her stones to the surface. It was noon. The rusty bells on the fishmonger's stalls made a slow racket as men shook them for attention, and a boy tripped and fell, and got up and did not cry. Missandei turned her head toward the place where she thought the sept might be, though she had not seen it yet, and imagined a cold interior where voices touched stone and came back altered. They ate in a place where the bread was indeed less stale, the butter more honest than most butter, the wine the color of rinsed iron. Missandei ate slowly, because eating quickly made hunger an accident, rather than a need fulfilled. Varys talked of how many ships had been sunk in the Blackwater the day of wildfire, and how many had been half-lifted since, of the reach a king thought he had, and the reach he truly possessed, of the love of small men for small decrees, and the hatred of large men for the same. Missandei thought of gannets throwing themselves into waves and rising with fish in their beaks. She thought of a note she had written in a margin of another document about the word in Astapor, for a knot that can be untied by a finger placed in the right loop rather than by a knife. At moonrise she kept her word. She went with 2 unsullied and a city man Varys had supplied, who had eyes like a rat and hands like a grandmother's, soft in the appropriate places. Ganakab smelled like a body that has learned defeat and refused it. The letter was written on good parchment, subtly scented with cedar, to keep the gnats from it. Addressed to the man who oversaw the Free Council's letters and never slept more than 2 hours at a time. Missandei wrote in the Common of Westeros, and then in Market Valyrian, and then in the tighter, older script that had belonged to houses before the harps fell silent. She sealed it with a seal she had had cut not long ago in a smithy that had once made finger sheaths for a master to put on before touching certain slaves. A broken chain, yes, but the bent link shaped not like a mouth opened wide in a cry. How dramatic, how useless, but like a bird's beak just opening to let out something small and necessary. She handed the letter to the man who handled the ravens in the rookery under the Red Keep. He had hands that looked clean to the eye, and much more importantly, felt clean in the way they took the letter. A strange thing, the knowledge of such a fact. But Missandei had learned to weigh such strangenesses, and had never found a scale that would not take them. The man took the letter and a coin to tell him that some letters were as heavy as a man's bones. He bowed over them as if smelling them, and the smell pleased him. The bird's wings made the sound of a wet fan. It went up and then out into the dark, moving as if it had always known its way. The next day smelled of heat and flies. There were more men at the dock where Astapor's ship had moored than there had been yesterday, and several of them had the special slouch of men who came for trouble without the coin to make it worth their while. Missandei felt the city watching her governor's ribbon and her plain dress, and decided to make the morning hers before it could be broken into by others. She went among the rope coils and spoke to the rope man about the price of hemp, and she did it in a voice louder than yesterday's. She asked a man with tattooed knuckles whether the pilings had rotted, and had him take an iron point and show her where they had not. She learned 3 names and used 2 of them. When a pair of men in green-dyed caps came to harry the Unsullied about shields, no shields allowed on certain parts of the quay, they said, and no spears. She smiled and asked for the text of the law in that matter, and set a boy to fetch it, and stood in the sun, and read until the men grew warmer than she did, and went away. The Unsullied stood like a cool wind, while the city walked around them like men will walk around a stone they are not ready to lift. In the afternoon she went again up the hill, and this time the king was there. A boy carved too sharply for his own wood. his hand restless on the arm of his chair when it was not scratching at a dog's head. His mother sat and did not sit, her body a length of tension that could have been a bow. The boy made a sound about dogs and a question about whether Astapor's soldiers cut off their parts on purpose. Missandei answered with care, with a small history that made the king's interest take him away from cruelty, which was a simple trick boys did not like to be seen falling for. Tywin watched the move with the expression of a man who notes that the board has another piece on it than he supposed, and then puts out his hand for it and puts it into his set for later use. The parchment moved back and forth across the table enough times that its edges began to soften. Cersei asked a question about whether Astapor would harbor a woman who had grievances against her father's house, and a boy who had been ugly when he was born, naming no names, and yet naming them. Missandei spoke of locks and doors again, and the way neighbors sometimes leaned their ladders against one another's walls. Varys made a soft sound about ladders that did not seem only for Littlefinger, who pursed his mouth and made himself busy with a quill that did not need to be sharpened. In the evenings, Missandei walked in the cool places of the city and listened to the stones. There was a place where 3 lanes met around a pump, and women of the Street of Flower came there with buckets and children and gossip that sounded like birds pulling threads from a ragged shawl. There was a twist of alley where a man sold little cakes fried in oil that smelled of olives and of a spice she himself could not put a name to in any language she knew, which gave her pleasure because it meant this city could still surprise her. There were stairs up and stairs down and stairs to nowhere, because bricks outlast plans. She took a measure of the place with her feet and her ears, and went to her room and wrote out columns that were not numbers, but felt like columns. Men who could be moved by coin, men who could be moved by fear, women who could not be moved, which was a kind of anchor you tied a line to. 2 mornings after the letter to Astapor flew, a raven came back with a ragged look to its wings that made Missandei want to stroke it with her palm, the way she had once done to little birds on Eneath when a storm had run them ragged and dropped them. The seal on the reply had been pressed with a thumb that had a scar across the nail. That would be Encatho, who had once been a counter in a counting house, and was now the one who slept less than anyone else. The letter itself was written in workman's Valyrian with a respect for grammar that would have pleased the masters if they had not been lying in alleys with flies in their eyes. Ganakab, last known to be in Yunkai, owned by a caravaner with 4 mules and a wife who wore more coins than she had teeth. A man had been sent to ask what could be asked, and another man had been told to go speak to a woman who remembered women. The 2 men would quarrel, and then one would win, and Missandei would send coin to the one who won so he did not have to steal it from her to feel right. She went down with the letter to Ganna's sister. The girl read with her lips moving a little, and Missandei kept her face like the face of a woman watching the sea to learn what weather comes. And when the mouth had been read to its end, the girl looked up and made a small sound that was not joy and not grief, and then she folded the letter into her bodice as if to keep it warm. "Thank you," she said, without any tricks or anger, and Missandei felt that the simple sentence would become something in her bone the way a little shard of shell becomes an irritant in an oyster. And then, given time, a pearl. The treaty, or the understanding, as Tywin's mouth insisted on calling it, grew ribs. It acquired a map of how many men from Astapor could stand on the quay and not be thought of as soldiers. It acquired a line about the price of a weight of saffron and the price of the same saffron if a man tried to call it doré and sell it as if he were from Lys. It acquired a clause about how to speak to judges when speaking to judges must be done, and who would become angry if spoken to too plainly. It acquired a little flourish in the corner of the copy that would stay in the red keep. Not the sort of flourish men admire, but enough to tell a clerk later if the parchment had been lifted and replaced with a more useful one, because the little flourish could not be remade without the hand that had made it, and the hand belonged to a boy Missandei had watched in the scriptorium for an afternoon. And the hand belonged to a boy Missandei had watched in the scriptorium for an afternoon to see how he held his On the 5th day, trouble came seeking itself. Men with the wrong colored sashes and the wrong way of standing in a crowd came to the place where the Unsullied stood and began asking questions with their shoulders. It was not yet noon. Missandei had been 2 streets away, arranging for a cooper to mend a warped cask her men had claimed because the smell of the iron hoops was right. She knew the smell of trouble and the smell of iron hoops when heated, and the two scents braided into one and sent her walking down a lane in quiet. The men with the wrong sashes looked like rivermen who had never seen a river, and one of them had a scar like a dimple gone bad. That man spoke in a loud voice about foreigners and about queens with silver hair, and about how men without their parts were not men and so their word could not be taken. Missandei did not look at the unsullied leader, for he would do what he must if words failed, and she did not want to make it seem as if she thought he could be turned by her glance. She stepped into the little circle the wrong-sashed men had made with their bodies. She lifted both hands, palms out, as if showing she had nothing. "It is a hot day," she said in common. "There is better shade 2 streets over if you wish to argue about men's parts. The pillars of the granary make good sound." She let her eyes go calm over the faces. "But here, the sun will make you say things you do not mean, and the men with baskets will become angry with you for making them spill the catch, and then you will have 2 angers to carry instead of 1. A laugh came from somewhere behind the wrong men. It was not derision. It was the sudden release of a man whose shoulder had been tensed too long. The laugh was important in a way that did not require the laugher to be a man of importance. One of the wrong men turned, looked toward the laugh, saw no mass ready to back him, and when he turned back to Missandei, his mouth had lost some of its eagerness. "We do not take orders from a..." He stopped, perhaps because he had been going to choose a word, and found all the words he had brought with him looked worse now. He had to put them into air. "You do not take orders from anyone today," Missandei said, and did not smile. "You take water, and you take yourself away. And if you wish to speak of women who command men, you can climb the hill and say the word queen again where there are ears that paid 3 times what yours cost." She made it a cut, because cuts sometimes kept men from making wounds. A woman in the fish market put her hand to her mouth in a small gasp of pleasure, which made other women giggle the way women will when someone has been knocked down without a shove. The wrong men took themselves away in the direction of a tavern, which is a place men go to in order to feel as if they had done something, when they have not. The unsullied did not move. The man who led them did not look at her or thank her. He did not even soften. But Missandei saw the fraction by which his spear lifted a little higher, and the fraction by which his breathing eased. She took that, and she took the sound of women giggling. And she took the knowledge that Varys would have someone tell someone else about this in a way that would add a half coin to her ledger and subtract a half coin from someone else. And she placed the 3 things in a line in her mind to look at later. Late the next afternoon, she returned to the small council chamber with ink on her fingers and a grain of grit inside one sandal. There were fewer men now. Matters had been moved forward along the little rails men lay for such things, when they are done speaking but have not begun to do. Tywin looked at her evenly and folded his forearms across the table and said, "The king will agree." The sentence struck her chest in a way that wordless things did. She did not bow. She did not curtsy. She inclined her head as much as felt not false. Tywin continued, "The parchment will not call itself a treaty, but the clauses will be bound with the king's seal. Your council will sign in the way that you sign things. We will send a copy with our master of ships to the harbor, where a thing with wood and ropes can happen to it that will make the harbor think it belongs to it. You will send a copy with one of your men to be hung up in a place where the market can see it. Any man who spits on it can be pushed in a way that does not ruin the paper." "Then? Bow." "Words nailed up," said Cersei with a curl of amusement. "Have a way of turning to arrows when it suits someone's hand. Then we will watch the hands," Missandei said, "and see who buys fletching." She saw it then, in Tywin's face, the tiniest degree by which he conceded something private to the picture she had drawn, that her sentences were built with attention to consequences, and that the woman who built them knew the names of men who sold feathers, and why such men mattered. He slid the parchment toward her with a movement that was not courtesy, and was not contempt. He pushed other small things that would add up to the day, and then stopped. Littlefinger had not come today. Varys was here, and the span of his attention felt like a shawl laid over the room. The king was elsewhere, perhaps with dogs, perhaps in a courtyard where boys were told how to hold swords by men who had learned one thing well. The parchment lay between her and the hand of the king, like a plank between two rocks on a stream. She took up the quill. She dipped it. She wrote the name she had decided on. Missandei of Neath. On behalf of the Free Council of Astapor. On behalf of those who spoke for those who could not yet speak. Her hand did not tremble. She did not make it pretty, for prettiness made men look, and not read. She handed the quill to Tywin, who did not take it because he did not have to, and watched a clerk bring the hand with the right habit forward to make the king's name into a seal. The wax bled from under the stamp like blood from under a thumbnail. It settled. It shone. When she left the chamber, the wind had shifted. It came now up the hill from the sea rather than down from the hill to the sea. And it carried the call of a bell that was not the bell of the sept, but a smaller bell, on a mule's harness, which pleased her more. She went down toward the rookery to ask if any letter had come yet about Ganachab, and when there was none she told herself that letters are their own sort of ship, and must be measured by their own sort of tide. She climbed back to a little room, where a window looked out over a red roof, and then the next roof, and then a patch of sky that looked dirty only if you had known a sky without smoke in it. She put the small ledger of names at the corner of the table, and the long parchment in the center, and the ribbon staff beside it. She thought of Daenerys then, and did not say her name out loud. She thought of the girl-woman with hair like wheat, just at the point of turning white, the way she had listened, the way she had walked in front of men with dragons behind her, and learned to make those dragons into the punctuation her words required, and not the words themselves. Missandei had never had a dragon. She had not needed one today. The city had 1,000 tongues, and 1,000 ears, and 1,000 knives. She had given it a word it did not yet know how to hold. In the morning, she would have to go out into the streets and teach it, without saying she was teaching. She rose before dawn the next day, and went down to the quay. The unsullied moving, like inking shadows beside her. The water looked like forged iron again. Men yawned with buckets. Boys flicked pebbles at a post to get their arms warm for work. The parchment in her hand had acquired a weight, as if it were a small loaf. A man with a broom swept fish. Scales into a pile that caught the first light and became a little moon. She liked that deeply, in that secret way that lets a woman kneel into a day and say, "I see you. I will work you. I will not let you pass without the respect of noticing." She lifted the parchment high enough for the men closest to see, and said, loud enough to make the fishmonger's bell pause for a beat, "Hear this." She read the names of those who had bound their names to the thing she held, and some men laughed, because names were always funny when taken away from faces and made to lie flat. She read the first articles. She read the one about the right of return. She read the one about the quay, and the number of men, and the kind of rope, and who paid for it, and when. She did not read the one about pretenders. That one would be heard when it needed to be heard. She finished. She did not roll the parchment up. She let men look at it. She let a boy near enough to smell it. He smelled wax and ink and old skin. He would remember the smell more than the words. She accepted that. She hung the parchment in a frame hammered into a post with nails that felt too large for the job. Men watched. A woman came and touched it, as if for luck. Another woman snorted and said something biting about luck, in a city that had chewed better luck than any of them would ever see. A man made to spit and then looked at her plain ribbon and thought better. And she saw how the thought turned around and went back into his throat like a fish that had learned to swim backward. The bell from the little mule tolled again on some other street. The sun took up its place as competent as a bookkeeper opening his ledger, and men went to their work with a sense that something had happened that had to go along with them like a new tool, heavy and useful and awkward for the first half hour. Missandei stood with one hand lightly on the frame and felt the sawdust of the morning on her skin where a cooper had planned a stave. She thought of Ganna and the letter, and the boy who smelled the parchment, and the women who laughed, and the men who did not spit. She thought of the number of streets in this city she had not yet walked and would have to walk, and of the number of places in Astapor where the brick had not yet been remade into anything but rubble and would have to be laid again by hands that did not yet know how to do it together. She thought of the clause about pretenders, and of the way Tywin's mouth had not quite hidden its interest in it, and of the way Varys' eyes had waited, and then deflected it into a sort of nod, and of the way Cersei had tried to cut it with something that resembled wit. She thought of Littlefinger, and the absence he had made today, which had been as precise as his usual presence. The tide made its slow speech against the pilings. She answered it in silence. Around her, the city took breath, and began to use the day, and the word treaty existed now, not as something two men said to one another, in a chamber with a long table, but as a thing hammered into wood and air. Men breathed. It would be stolen, surely. It would be spat upon at midnight when men were drunk enough to be brave. It would be copied badly by someone who did not understand that certain words were not to be altered. It would in time either become a habit in men's mouths, or it would become a story about how a woman from far away had read something aloud on a morning, and hung it in a frame like a saint's bone, and how it had done nothing but keep the flies off the spot where it hung. Missandei knew something of bones and of flies. She knew something of frames and of men's habits. She had time, and she had a ledger, and she had a ribbon not bright enough to blind men, but plain enough to be seen even by those who preferred not to look. She stood with these things, and with the sea, and with the city, and let the line of the morning draw straight through her. The gulls took to the air above the black water with their torn crying talk, and their wings wrote brief chalk lines against a sky that was not so much gray as a color that was the sea and the smoke and the breath of 1,000 men and women making a day. She watched those lines. She filed them where she kept the weather and the faces and the words that would need to be said when a hand, some hand, perhaps tomorrow's, moved to undo the knot she had tightened. Ka. The gulls made their circles and cut them like dough with knives you could not see. Men hauled baskets and cried prices, and discovered with surprise that their voices were different today, as if an old smoke had cleared from their throats and left them with a pitch they did not know they could hold. Missandei stood with her palm against the frame until the wood grew warm beneath her hand. She did not watch for men who might come to pull the parchment down. The Unsullied watched for such men. She watched instead for the first man who would point at the words and attempt to make them do a thing they were not meant to do. That man would tell her where the weaknesses lay. It took less time than she had thought. A trader in a sea-green cap with a slit at the crown, mended with thread of another color, approached with a bundle of dyed linen under his arm and a smile like a debt that had been forgiven for the pleasure of being remembered. He made a show of reading, pinched his mouth over claws too, as if it were sour wine, and turned with elaborate care to her, touching the side of his cap with 2 fingers, as if to suggest that he liked hats and would like to keep his. "Lady," he said, putting the word to her with an exactness that might have been courtesy, or might have been a knife wrapped in wool. "If a man has held a contract that was signed when things were different, is he to be found a thief now for keeping to it? If his contract purchases a man," Missandei said, "and let the sentence rest, it does not purchase him against the man's will if the man is Westerman. If the man is not Westerman, the contract will be taken to pieces and remade by the men who now hold the law in Astapor, and the woman who knows the names in King's Landing." She gave him her small smile. "Or it will be made into kindling." He laughed at kindling, as she had known he would. "Ah, words and fires," he said. "I like both best when they are other men's problems." He tapped the frame lightly with his knuckles. "In Myr, we hang such things with iron staples. Nails can be pulled. Staples draw blood from the wood when you take them out." Nenduan said her. "We are not in Myr," Missandei said. And the man's eyebrows rose as if she had complimented him on the sleekness of his cap. "Praise the Seven for that," he said cheerfully, and moved off with the careful indifference of a cat, leaving a room where milk had been spilled. The sun set its ledger open, and the morning wrote itself line by line. When the day had filled the space it could fill, Missandei went up the hill, 2 Unsullied at her back, and 1 in the street beyond that. So they did not look like a procession, but like pieces of the city that happened to be arranged by a hand that could see their shape. Varys was waiting in a shaded arcade just below the Queen's ballroom, his hands folded, his gaze on the middle distance, as if reading a sign far away. "Lady Margaery sent word," he said without preamble, which was itself a courtesy. "She would be pleased to have bread with you." Her maid assures me the bread will be made of flour and not of talk. Now, I am pleased to be asked, Missandei said, and let the Unsullied remain at the arcade's mouth while she followed Varys through a side door, where a maid in a green kirtle did not quite bow. They met in a small chamber that had been made comfortable by someone's good sense rather than someone's gold. The windows were open to invite a breeze that could not be commanded. A bowl of figs sat on the table as if they had been set there by the tree itself. Marguerite Tyrell rose from a chair, and the movement of her dress made a dry sound like straw being gathered. She was softer than Cersei, which was not to say soft. A young willow and not an old thorn. Her eyes were mild, until you listened to what they said when they were still. Missandei of Neath, she said, as if the name had belonged to her once, and she was glad to have found it again. I had hoped to meet the woman who made the hand bend like a reed and call a treaty an understanding. Words bring other words, Missandei said, and Marjorie laughed, gently, as if laughing were a thing to be used sparingly. They ate bread that was warm without being proud of it, and a soft cheese that had gone almost too far, and therefore was perfect. Marjorie asked about Astapor's bricks and about the way men learned to buy and sell, when all they had known was how to obey. She did not pretend, and so Missandei did not pretend with her. They learn in the only way there is for such things, Missandei said. They are cheated once, and then they learn how not to be cheated again. There is a way to teach a child to swim where you throw him in and then you wait to see if he floats. This is that way. The difference is that there is a rope with knots at need if the teacher is not cruel. You are not cruel, Marjorie said, as if saying the words aloud set them into a column where they could be found later. But you know how cruelty works. Knowing the name of a knife is not the same as liking to hold it, Missandei said. Marjorie turned the stem of a fig between finger and thumb. Will your queen come? She asked without coyness. I have no queen here, Missandei said, and in her chest Neath lifted its wings. I have a city with needs and hands that shake when they try to hold their own cups for the first time in their lives. I am to be a queen, Marjorie said matter-of-factly, and inserted herself into the sentence as if it had always been the arrangement. Queens are told that cups are no business of theirs, only crowns. This is foolishness. Men spill more from cups than from crowns. Men who cups can be refilled, Missandei said. Crowns too, Marjorie said with a flicker in her eyes that asked to be ignored, and therefore was. I will send pastry to the quay tomorrow. Not the sweet sort that mothers save for boys. The savory sort that can be eaten standing and does not show on the tongue as if a man had been stealing it. Thank you, Missandei said simply, because the pastry would make a difference to the men who had begun to think the quay was theirs to protect. Cersei came to Missandei the next day like weather that had moved across the city, while no one in the street had looked at the sky. She entered the room where Missandei had been reading a map of tides, and did not wait for anyone to say that she could. The Queen Regent wore green like a challenge, and a scent of crushed leaves that might have been meant to seem accidental. Her hair was the color of wheat in a field under the sort of sun men imagine will last forever. You bind men with paper, she said in a tone that would have been flatter if she had been less interested. It is not a thing to be proud of. Paper rots. Bricks crack, Missandei said, putting a pin in the map to hold a thought she wished not to lose. We build with both where I come from, and with rope when the day is windy. Cersei's smile was lovely and empty as a drained goblet. You speak of pretenders not to be harbored, and yet you mean a woman who thinks herself a queen. I am surprised you did not speak her name to my father when you were telling him how you wished our city to behave. Names have their own work to do, Missandei said. Perhaps, Cersei said, you will come and see the king later. He would like to know what is to be done with men who call themselves what they are not. He has ideas about such things. She moved her gaze over Missandei's dress, with the sharp kindness of a woman looking to measure a seam she intends to cut. It is an art, choosing what to hang in a frame and what to burn. Everything burns, given enough time, Missandei said. Even iron. I prefer to use time for other things, Cersei said, and left the room without looking back to see who watched her go. Word of the treaty went out the way word goes. On carts, in the belly of bread that a woman shared with her sister, across the backs of men who carry baskets. It moved into the street of steel, and settled in the hollows of hammered shields as a topic to talk about while water boiled. It went into the sept on the breath of a woman who had permission to sweep near the steps, and therefore hear things the highborn wished to have heard by no ears but theirs. It went down into the cups of the men who stood at the doors of taverns, and chose who entered, and who did not by counting their coins, and not counting their faces. Some men liked that the king had agreed to call a thing an understanding. Some men said that if the king could not feed the city, and needed bread from far places, then he should give the crown to someone whose hands were larger. A boy in a stable picked up the talk, and learned to say the word Astapor without tripping, and then he taught it to another boy. A man with hair like winter straw told a lie about the unsullied and their parts that he had heard from a listenee who had heard it from a man who had never seen the unsullied and swore that he had. The lie grew legs. Lies like to run when they think they have learned to walk. Missandei spent her hours in small work that looked like nothing from a hill and like everything from 2 paces away. She brought a cooper to the quay and spoke of staves and hoops and the price of new iron, if the king's men wished to charge a penny per hoop. But she spoke with a weighman about the way to set a beam so that a scale would not favor the man who brought his own. She took a broom herself and swept the spot under the frame, because men notice what you make your hands do more than what you make your mouth say. A letter came from across the sea, with its edges frayed by fingers that had opened and closed it in transit, as if it might be a net for fish. And Katha's hand again, neat even when tired. Yunkai was choked with men who had fled Astapor when the brick changed color. Some of them had new badges on their belts and new knives at their sides. Ganakab had been seen in a street that ran toward the caravan gate, carrying a tray with cups for men who sat in shade, and did not look at her because men who sit in shade seldom look at anyone they think will not shade them in return. A woman in the washing place remembered Ganna's hair, and said she braided it herself while saying the names of streets in Lannisport to her, so the girl would have a map to walk into in her sleep. The woman had been given coin to tell what she knew, and had put the coin into her shoe because she had no belt. Men would go to the caravan gate and ask the man with 4 mules whether he had need of a girl with small fingers. The letter ended with the name of a ship that would take an answer back, even if the man who carried it had to sing to the wind. Missandei pressed the paper to her lips because she had no other way to bless it. She sent coin back, and a name that had weight in Astapor now because her mouth gave it weight. She sent the promise of a sum to cover the price the man with 4 mules would pretend someone had paid for Ganna, though the price would be a lie told for the sake of dignity, which men like as much as they like truth when it is on their side. She sent a sentence for the woman for the washing place to speak in Ganna's ear about a door in King's Landing, and a girl who would open it when the moon climbed to a certain window. She sent a line that would mean nothing to anyone who was not a Nethi. Wings in shade, fruit split by thumbs. Take a breath for home before you take another breath. Varys came in the evening and stood in her doorway without shadow, because the light came from behind him. "There's a letter from Yunkai," he said with the surprise of a man who finds a coin exactly where he left it. "There is," Missandei said. "They are not pleased that our brick holds. They write in a style that has been fashionable there since before your masters forgot how to speak without a whip." Varys said mildly, "They wish to remind us that Astapor is a rickety raft built on a flood. They wish to suggest that the king's hand might slip when he holds his seal and drop it into the black water. And if the king's hand slips, it will be because the man who owns it wishes to see where the seal goes when it falls," Missandei said. Varys smiled at that and moved a finger across a spot on the wall where the plaster had been smoothed and left a little wave in it. "There will be an attempt," he said, in the way men say rain when they smell it before the rest of the city has looked up. "It will not be the worst attempt anyone has made in this city, or the cleverest. It will be made by men who think they know where a woman from far away keeps her courage." "Man, enter." Missandei did not ask who. She looked at the slice of sky in her window and judged the hour by the color. "They come with meat. My men will not eat it. If they come with wine, my men will call for clean water. If they come with hands, they will leave with fewer fingers." Varys inclined his head to the poetry of that and said, in a tone light enough not to weigh the air. One of the king's uncles once said that if you teach a dog to sit, you must also teach him to bite. You have taught your men to sit. I think you know about the other. Men are baral. The men need no lessons about biting, Missandei said. I have taught them how to count to 10 when a man screams into their faces that they are not men. She placed her palm flat on the table. I will sleep in the room without a window tonight. He could have asked why. Instead he said, I will put a man 2 doors down who will not be seen unless he wishes to be. It will make me feel as if I were useful. That is a good feeling, Missandei said. I wish it for you. She slept in the room without a window on a pallet that had the humility to be more comfortable than a bed. The attempt came in the hour after midnight, when men think the city has closed its eyes and no longer has anything to say. 3 of them, light on their feet in a way that had been learned in alleys where doors open outward. One had a knife notched as if it had chewed fat and wanted to chew more. One had hands that had been burned and therefore learned how to move without touching hot things. One had a mouth like a seam. They moved with confidence, which is sometimes useful and sometimes not. The first met the butt of an unsullied spear in the dark and discovered that breath will go out of a man if his stomach is taught a lesson. The second put his palm on the floor to balance and found a wire he did not see, though he had laid it himself, and his fingers learned to forget the wire only when the spear point told them why. The third called out a name that was not Missandei's and therefore learned that he had walked into the wrong story and would have to find his way out of it with a different ending than the one he had come to tell. They were not killed. They were shown to the door with the sort of hurt that makes a man think better the next day if he is capable of thinking. One spat blood and a tooth onto the coin of the doorframe and looked at Missandei with a wounded interest that told her he would not try again. He wanted a story to tell. She gave him one. Tell the man who sent you. She said, her voice like a linen cloth wetted and wrung out and spread flat on a table. That I taught men to sit. Tell him I also taught them to stand. They went. Beresis' unseen man rearranged himself in the darkness with the serenity of a mantle being shaken. The city's breath calmed. Missandei lay down and counted to 100 slowly, and took a sip of water and slept as if sleep were a coin she had the right to spend. In the morning, she went to the harbor court. No more than a slate-topped table, under a board that declared itself a place where disputes would be heard by men who were not supposed to be paid for hearing them, though of course they were. The master of ships had sent a man with an ink-stained beard to hear a matter about pilots and 2 galleys that had nearly kissed when one should have yielded. Missandei attended because she wished the men who made the harbor move to see that the woman with the ribbon was not a shadow in a room up the hill, but a body that would stand where their bodies stood and take the heat of the sun. She stood in the shade. Even courtesies must be rationed. Halfway through the hearing, a Junkish factor arrived with 3 men in yellow sashes and a face that made itself a mask of concern for the convenience of others. He bowed deeply enough to declare that he would bow no deeper and announced that Junkai protested Clause 5, which he had not yet seen with his own eyes, but which birds had told him of. He had a letter with a seal. He had a way of speaking the common tongue that made the words go slippery. You protest that King's Landing will not harbor men who write letters to be welcomed with knives? Missandei asked, and the factor's mouth twitched because he disliked being made to resolve his sentences. We protest that Astapor believes itself to be a city that can write such clauses and have men in other cities read them without laughing, the Yunkishman said blandly. We protest that the woman who speaks for Astapor here in the city of the king is a certain woman in a certain sort of service to a certain other woman whose hair one hears will be seen at the head of a certain army in due time. We protest as a matter of form because form matters. Yunkai believes all kinds of things matter, Missandei said. The shape of a whip matters. The price of a child matters. The size of a man's purse matters. The form of a document matters when the man who reads it is a man who wishes to keep his hands clean, while other men do dirty work. We understand forms in Astapor as well. We have forms for breaking chains. We have forms for weighing bread. We have a form for telling men who stand in our harbor that they may not be paid by another city to start a fight in ours. Now, the harbor clerk looked as if he wished to be elsewhere, and also as if he wished to be present when a story he would later tell was being made. The factor's smile stayed in place with the stubbornness of a jewel stuck onto a mask with glue that has not set. "You are brave," he said. "Bravery is a quality that is admired in children and in animals. In men, when they remember they have some," Missandei said. The Yunkishman's eyes went flat for a moment, and in that moment Missandei saw the man under the cloth and his hatred for being made to look like what he was in the sunlight. "Yunkai has much to trade," he said, controlling his breath like a man counting coin aloud. "King's Landing has much want. It would be a pity if the want were multiplied because a woman with a piece of paper has decided to test the patience of a city that has been patient for a long time. Men. The city on the hill has the hand it has," Missandei said. "He does not prefer pity as a coin. He does not accept threats paid into his hand with weak fingers. If you would like to carry a letter up to him and tell him that you came to the harbor court to frighten a woman on a morning when the sun was not even at its noon height, you may do so. I will not stop you. But I will send a letter after you telling him the shape of your mouth when you said your words. He is a man who reads shapes." Memneru. The factor's lips twitched, as if the glue had softened a little. He bowed again, less than before, and departed with the efficiency of a man who has decided that his time is better spent writing insult in another room. The harbor clerk released a breath that moved the page on which he had been writing, and lifted his quill, because hands need something to do when an exit has left a space where a body had been. "You spoke clearly," the clerk said. "Some men prefer fog. I find fog more useful when one is trying to bring a ship into a harbor and does not wish an enemy to see how near one is," Missandei said. "Today, we were not bringing a ship." Later, when the sun had lost its height and the wind had chosen to remember that the sea existed, Missandei climbed the hill to the rookery to see whether a bird had come with news from the other side. The rookery smelled of straw and something sharp that cleans the air after the stink of many birds. The man with clean hands received her and shook his head with a grief that had the good manners to be small. "Not yet," he said, and it was a mercy that he did not add, "My lady," with pity in it. "Thank you," Missandei said, and because she could not bear the weight of wanting for one more breath, she asked him a question about the breed of ravens that carried best in heat, and he told her, and by the end of the telling she could stand again. A summons came from Tywin as she was leaving the rookery. Nothing more than a boy with a clean face and a tunic too short in the sleeves who said, "My lord wishes to see you," as if he were bringing word of rain. She found the hand in a chamber with a long window cut like an arrow slit, widened by men who preferred air to arrows. He was reading. He let her stand while he finished the paragraph and the one after that, and then he raised his eyes with the calm of a man who knows that a paragraph will forgive him if he leaves it unfinished. "You enjoy making enemies," he said, without rancor. "I do not enjoy it," Missandei said. "I do not avoid it when leaving a man his comfort will cost me a thing I cannot afford." Tywin studied her face as if he were considering where it would crack, and whether the crack would be straight or run off at an ugly angle. The Yunkish were expected. Their letter says what such letters always say. A man in their pay will come to you dressed as a man not in their pay and offer you a kindness. He will then ask of you a small thing that is really a larger thing wrapped in silk. You will say no. He will then ask you if you are sure. You will say yes. He will then ask your guard to do a thing that will make the guard feel like a man in a story he has heard all his life. If the guard is foolish, he will do it. If he is wise, he will not. Which sort have you? Then, Eddie. There are no foolish unsullied, Missandei said, and saw the smallest pleased movement in the muscle of Tywin's cheek that told her she had answered in a way that gave him what he wanted. Certainty shaped like responsibility. The clause about pretenders, he said, has made certain men who speak in certain rooms at night unhappy. They are men who like their options. They like to keep many doors ajar. You have closed one and locked it. They will tell you it was a draft. It was not. It is a door. You have also closed it for yourself, though you will not say the name. Then tower. Doors open onto other doors, Missandei said. A woman can go at an angle if she has to. The angle you go at will tell me whether you are useful to me, Tywin said. And there was nothing cruel in it. It was arithmetic. The king is pleased to think of sailors carrying flour through a gate under the watch of his men. He does not like to think of sending those men to find other men in a foreign city and bring them home. It is untidy. Nevertheless, I will write 2 letters to men who like tidy things even less than I do. One will go to a man in Pentos who keeps his fingers clean while other men in Pentos boast of their dirty nails. One will go to a man in Bravos who counts without touching anything. They will see letters from Astapor that speak of men with English names, Westermen, as your paper says. If they find any such men in places where their names ought not to be, they will send them to me. They will do it for coin, and for the pleasure of making another man do a thing he did not know he wanted to do, which is its own coin. His mouth tightened as if a thought had grazed him and not broken skin. I will not do this again, he said. It is a favor I do not like to do. Do not ask me for it again. When you have to ask someone for the same favor twice, you have asked too late the first time. I will not ask twice, Missandei said, and kept her own breath smooth while her heart knocked in her ribs, like a door in a wind. She left Tywin with the sense that she had not only kept her balance, but had shown him that she could stand on one foot while men tried to jostle her, which was a trick he valued. On the stairs down, she met Littlefinger for the first time since the day of long talk at the table. He had a way of standing that made him seem to lean without support on air, as if the city had been kind enough to provide him with a wall wherever he happened to need one. You have a talent for putting nails into wood where other men think nothing will hold, he said, as if he were admiring a carpentry trick. I have a talent for finding wood that wishes to hold something, Missandei said. He inclined his head minutely. There is a matter of coin, he said, as if confiding a sin. Coin prefers to move along the channels it knows. One hand, another hand, a third hand, and then the cup. You have made a channel that is straight. Men do not like to see their hands removed from a channel. They will say the channel leaks. It is not the channel that leaks. Hands leak, Missandei said. Hands leak, Littlefinger agreed, smiling with real pleasure at hearing a thought he had considered emerge from someone else's mouth. You will see a leak made where one does not exist, so that men may be engaged to fix it for a fee. Then we will stand where they propose to dig and ask them to show us the water, Missandei said. Oh, we, Littlefinger murmured. It is a lovely word. It makes men think that the person who says it stands in 2 places at once. I stand where I stand, Missandei said, and stepped past him so his body did not become the door he wished to be. At the quay, a cart overturned at noon with the heavy torpor of a beast that has decided to lie down where it stands. Barrels of dried peas rolled out, popped their tops, and made a sound on the stones like rain. Men cursed. Boys cried out with the pain of their thin feet on the peas underfoot. A gold cloak waded in and began to shout orders in the tone of a man who believes that if he shouts in the cadence of command, his words will make more sense. Missandei took up an armful of peas and began to scoop them with her hands into a barrel. She did not call for a broom. She did not look at the gold cloak until he had shouted 3 times, and the 3rd time had faltered of its own weight. By then the men had seen her and had begun to scoop. The peas, recovered by handfuls, became a story that stayed under their fingernails and came back to their mouths at dusk over wine. The woman with the ribbon had hands that could lift what theirs lifted. At moonrise, Ganakab's sister came to the red door with her lips chapped and her eyes awake as a hunted animal's. Missandei took her up into a room with no table and no chair, and a rug that had been laid there by some woman once, and then forgotten. She spread another letter on the floor, another from Encatho, another from the washing place woman, and the girl knelt to read. And when she did not weep, it was because the words had not yet placed themselves inside her, not because there was no water to be had. Yunkai would not give the girl up for nothing, but the man with the mules had been drinking and had debts to a man who liked to be paid on time. A payment now would pay 5 debts at once. The woman in the washing place would bring Ganna to a door. If that could be done, Then a man would join them who had been told to look for a girl with hair braided in twin ropes, who would answer to a phrase only a Nethi would say. Missandei had written the phrase. It had to do with wings and shade and fruit. The woman was to speak it to Ganna and listen for the way the breath filled the room afterward. Soon, Missandei said, and sometimes the word is a lie. Men tell to keep their courage, but sometimes it is a true thing that needs air to breathe. Soon. The girl put her forehead to the rug. I will not forget, she said. And Missandei thought of shells inside oysters again, and of how they do their long secret work without anyone seeing, and of how patience is as sharp as any blade when it is time to cut. On the 7th morning, after the frame was hung, a ship from the Reach came into the harbor with the ease of a man walking into his own kitchen. It brought flour, yes, and it brought more important things: the smell of distant fields, the reassurance of a sail that was not tattered, the sight of men with their shoulders straight because they had not been bent by oars. The master of ship's man made a show of measuring the depth at the pilings. The weighman made a show of adjusting his scale to favor no one. A Tyrell retainer, with a badge shaped like a golden trumpet flower, oversaw the unloading with a face composed into a pleasant boredom that told the world he was working and had no time to be clever. Missandei stood at the side and said nothing. She watched the painted chalk marks go onto the sacks and be copied onto a slate, and she noted the way the chalk held in the heat and smudged in the shade. Such things matter. Ink is not the only way men keep count. Marguerite's pastry arrived in the afternoon in baskets, carried by girls with the confidence of lilies, in a garden that is well tended. They had been instructed to give them to any man who had sweat on his shirt, and not to any man whose shirt had been laced tight for the purpose of seeming important. The girls laughed as they gave them out, which made a better story of the day than a speech would have. Missandei took one and ate it standing, and made herself smile with her mouth, while her eyes continued to count the number of men who paid attention to the frame and the number who did not. That night, after the city had told its loud jokes and fallen into the quiet where individual voices could be heard again, there was a tapping at Missandei's door. Not a knock. A tapping as of knuckles that were afraid of the door's skin. She opened it to find a boy she had not seen before, thin as a reed, and with a scar across his scalp where hair no longer grew. He held out a small bag as if it were much heavier than it was. "A man said to bring you this," he said in a voice that had learned not to crack. "He said you would know the hand that sent it." She took the bag. It contained 5 coins and a small thing that at first her touch did not recognize. Then she realized it was a tooth. A woman's tooth. Small, with a chip in it. Her stomach did not turn. Her hands remained clean. She took out 1 coin and gave it to the boy and said, "Tell the man who sent you that he has used the wrong language, and ask him to send a letter next time. Letters are more expensive, and therefore men take them more seriously." The boy looked as if she had placed a feast on a table where he had expected to find a knife. "All right," he said, and left as lightly as if he had been made of paper himself. She sent the tooth to Varys without a note. He would know what to make of it. 2 mornings later, the Yunkish factor came back to the harbor court, with eyes that had not slept and a bruise on his cheek that had learned to be proud of itself. He said nothing about teeth. He stood for an hour while a matter of pilfered nails was resolved by men who had stolen nails themselves, and learned that sometimes a nail does not belong to anyone until it is hammered in. Then he bowed to Missandei and said, "We will not attempt courtesy again." And she said, "I am sorry," and meant it, because bad manners make a city smaller. The king sent for her at last on a morning that smelled of tar and roses, which was a combination she had not expected, and which therefore seemed right. He sat in his chair with his feet not reaching the floor, and a dog asleep under his hand. The dog thumped its tail when she entered. The king's hair made a halo around his ears that would have looked angelic if his eyes had not had the hard glitter boy's eyes sometimes have when they have just discovered that the world breaks if they push it. He asked about eunuchs. He asked about dragons. He asked if Astapor had women who were as pretty as the ones in King's Landing. He asked if she could teach him to say a word in Valerian that would make men tremble. "I can teach you a word that will make men listen," Missandei said. Trembling is a thing men do when they are cold or when they think a blow will fall. Listening is a thing men do when they are ready to learn. He tried the word. It was a simple word for please that had within it an older word for bread. He smiled when he made the sound well. Circe watched with a face that did not show whether she thought the lesson useful. Tywin stood behind the king and did not blink. Varys made a little pleased hum for himself. Missandei felt the room breathe. It was enough. The days laid themselves down like planks. Each one seemed like any other until you stepped on the fourth and felt it spring underfoot and realized a man had slipped a wedge under it at night. She made it her work to find the wedges. A gold cloak tried to demand coin from a man carrying a sack of saffron, because the sack was heavy, and therefore the spice must be rich. Missandei took the sack and opened it, and let the saffron spill onto her palm. And this made the gold cloak fear for a moment that she would throw the threads into the water, and then the man would hate him. She did not throw them. She made the man take a pinch and taste it, and then made the gold cloak taste it, so he could know what it was he had thought to steal. A merchant from Volantis tried to press into her hand a ring with a sigil carved in it. She gave him back the ring and took the name of the sigil and sent it to a man in a tavern who knew every sigil and who preferred to be paid in words. A boy stole a purse from a man from Old Town and was caught and beaten, and then released. Missandei had the boy brought to her and gave him a broom to sweep the spot under the frame. And when he had done it well, she sent him to the man in the tavern and gave him a word to carry that meant bread and work, and not being beaten again, if he learned not to use his hands for the wrong sort of work. Each of these things was not a plank, but each made the walk safer. The ship from Astapor came in on a morning choked with heat and a haze that turned the sun into a coin seen through dirty glass. It flew the plain linen flag with the ochre brick, and it made a sound with its throat as it came into the harbor, as if it had been told to clear its voice and speak. Men at the quay straightened in their spines, as if they had just remembered who they wished to be seen as, and men who had come with wrong-colored sashes watched from farther back with the blank attention of snakes. Missandei went down to the water and stood where the gangplank would fall. The captain, a woman with hair braided with strips of pale hide and scars on her knuckles where rope had made kisses, came first. Behind her, men with arms like branches lifted a crate and another, and then the long wooden box that contained what Missandei had been waiting for more than anything else. The box was not heavy. Weight is not only mass. It is the way a thing fits into the story around it. They set it on the stones. Missandei knelt and broke the wax with the edge of a nail she kept for such work, and the hinges made a sound like an old woman's knees. Inside lay a staff of dark wood, smooth with oil, and with a cap of hammered bronze at the head. Around the bronze a ribbon had been wound and sealed at the end with the same broken link seal that had marked the letter to Encatho. She lifted the staff with both hands and stood. The Unsullied closed around her, not in a shell but in a subtle half-circle that kept hands from her without making a wall. She held the staff up so the men at the quay could see the bronze. It was not a sword. It was not a whip. It was a thing you could use to point with, and to lean on, and to press into the earth to say, "Here is the line, and I will not cross it, and neither will you." A murmur moved through the crowd, not of fear but of recognition. A man who had scoffed a week before at words, nailed to wood, crossed himself as if an old belief had remembered his name and put a hand on his shoulder. The Yunkish factor, at the far edge, turned away suddenly as if he had to sneeze. Missandei let the murmur settle. She touched the bronze to the frame where the parchment hung, lightly, not to shake it, but to make an invisible line between the two. Then she lowered the staff. The day resumed itself, and shouts about rope and iron and fish swallowed the little tyranny of the moment and made it part of their peace. In her room that night, there was a letter from Astapor in a hand she did not know. It said Ganna Cobb had been brought to a door and told a sentence about wings and shade and fruit. She had taken a breath for home, and then another breath. She had been put on a cart with 2 other women and a sack of onions. The cart had left the city by the caravan gate and then left the road when the men at the gate looked elsewhere, because a man had fallen, and blood on a hot day makes men look away. The cart would go to a village where women sing while they work. There a woman who had once been someone else would take the girl by the hand and say another sentence that would mean turn, and the girl would turn and find a ship in a hidden cove that had never once been used for anything but leaving. If the winds were foolish and the men were kind, the ship would come to a place where a rookery handled letters with clean hands. The letter ended, "She will be held in the mouth of the world like a fish there, a moment before it is in the boat. Do not make noise. Do not scare her." Missandei slept with the staff within reach and dreamed of the sound of men breathing around her in the dark, not as a threat but as comfort, a human tide that rose and fell and moved boats on its back. At dawn, she woke to a knock that was a knock and not a tap. And Rose of the Tyrolls, Marjorie's maid with the smile that women use when speaking about dresses and about men, stood in the door with a basket of sugared almonds and a face that said a thing had happened to someone who had never thought it would happen to her. Missandei took the basket. She touched the maid's wrist in the Neathie way. "She is coming," Rose said, and the words were so simple that they did not need to be true to be good, and so brave that they did not need to be said aloud to be remembered. "Lady Marjorie thought you would like to eat something sweet while you waited." "I will eat one," Missandei said. "I will give the rest to the men who keep watch at the frame." Rose laughed. "You are a better queen than most." she said, and then put her hand over her mouth for saying more than she had intended. And Missandei smiled at her to show that the mouth could rest. That afternoon, the harbor court heard a matter about the price of saffron, when it is called by another name, and a matter about a barrel of ale that had been watered, and a matter about a sailor who had beaten a girl, and then claimed she had stolen his coin. Missandei listened to each as if it were the only thing she had to do that day. When the sailor spoke, she made him say out loud the number of coins he had, and the number was wrong. And so the court made him pay the girl twice what he had said she had stolen, and then a third time for lying, and the Goldcloaks enjoyed that math more than they should have. When the ale was tasted, she watched the faces of the men who tasted it and not their mouths, because the eyes tell the truth while the lips are thinking of a joke, and she learned which man enjoyed the taste of lying and which did not. When saffron was argued, she placed a thread on her tongue and let it soften in her saliva, and tasted the old summer that lives in saffron, if you have a tongue for such things. And the men saw her do it, and afterward, the word moved among them that the woman at the quay had a tongue for truth. At dusk, the ship from the hidden cove came in with a sail that had known too much salt. It did not go to a mooring. It cut into the small space between two boats where men mended nets and laid itself there with a tired sound, as if it were a dog coming to rest at its master's feet. 3 women and a sack of onions were lifted out. One woman was older and folded, and she wept without making noise. One was a woman with a blue headscarf, whose eyes looked as if they had been washed too many times with water that had something in it. The third was a girl with hair braided in twin ropes, whose elbows stuck out from her thinness like wings that had not learned to close. She did not weep. She looked at everything as if she needed to lay claim to it quickly before someone took it away again. Missandei went to her. She did not say her name. She said the sentence about wings and shade and fruit, and the girl made the sound that the woman in the washing place had told the letter she would make, the sound a small bird makes when it remembers a tree that it seemed to dream. She put one hand on the girl's cheek, and then on the other cheek, and then on her forehead, and said, "Your sister?" And the girl nodded as if a rope had been thrown to her from a ship, and she could feel the knots in it under her fingers. Genakab slept that night on a pallet near the door of the room with no window, and at moonrise her sister came to the red door and stood for a long time with her hand on the lintel, because sometimes a woman must hold the doorway before she can step through it. Then she stepped. Then the room was full enough of breath to make the candle flame wobble. The 2 girls put their foreheads together and made the soft, hungry sound that girls make when they are done being hungry for fear and ready to be hungry for bread. Missandei left them with a loaf and 2 mugs and a pitcher of water and a pitcher of milk, and went outside and stood under the slice of sky, and did not let herself weep until she had counted to 50. When she finished counting, she wept and made no sound. When she finished weeping, She took the small ledger of names and drew a line through Ganakab, and then wrote the name of the woman with 2 washed eyes beneath it, and wrote the word, Bravos, in the margin, as if by writing it she could make something happen in a place she had not yet seen. In the morning, she went to the small council with a basket of onions from the sack, because it is good to bring something to any table, even if the table is covered with papers. Tywin did not remark upon the onions, but he took one and turned it in his hand, as if it were a coin from a mint he did not know. Cersei looked at the onions, and then at Missandei, and said, Our Lady from the bricks brings us something from the earth. And Missandei said, You do not eat paper. And Varys smiled until his eyes disappeared, and Pycelle sniffed and pretended he remembered a time when onions had meant something to him. Littlefinger was not there. His absence made a shape that could be read. We have received a letter from Yunkai, Tywin said, and the letter lay on the table with the red wax seal of a city that had a great deal of wax and enjoyed using it. They accuse Astapor of... How do they phrase it, Grandmaster? Of being unsteady, Pycelle said, proud of the word as if it were his own. Of being a dangerous friend. Of making alliances with women whose hair is not the proper color. They mean silver, Cersei said, as if the word tasted bad. They mean the dragon girl. They say the harbor is a mouth that will swallow us. They say we will choke on brick. Missandei kept her mouth careful. Yunkai has a way of saying, you will be punished, when it means, we will have to work harder. Their letter says they are afraid. Bemau. Are they? Tywin asked. They are not afraid as children are, Missandei said. They are afraid as men are who have set their tables always the same way, and now someone has told them the plates will be laid elsewhere. They will break a plate to show that they do not care. Cersei's lip curled. Then let them cut themselves, she said. Tywin's mouth did not move. In the matter of Westermen, he said, we will send 2 ships to the Stepstones to look for certain names. He slid a slate across the table. The elegant hand that had written the names had a slight tilt, as if the writer had learned to write with a heavy pen. Missandei saw 3 names she had already written in her ledger. She permitted herself to think the word good and then put it away. We will not send men into Yunkai, Tywin said. We will send letters. Letters are swords with handles that do not get blood on the hands that hold them. Sometimes letters cut the wrong way, Littlefinger said from the doorway, and his absence had ended in the shape of his presence, exactly when it would make his sentence sound like prophecy. Sometimes they cut the one who sent them. Then the man who sent them should learn to hold them properly, Tywin said. And the room shifted its attention back to the hand that held the city like a pen. When the council ended, Missandei took the onions that had not been eaten down to the kitchen and exchanged them for bread to send with the girls. In the passage by the scullery, she met Margaery, not by chance. They walked together to a window where a vine sent a tendril inside, as if it wished to be part of the court, and not only the walls. Margaery touched the tendril with one finger and looked as if she were counting leaves. A girl came to the sept today, she said. She lit a candle and said nothing. A septa asked if she would like to say a name, and the girl shook her head and smiled as if she had forgotten how to cry. Ganna, Missandei said. Ganna, Margaery said, tasting the shape of the name. We will teach the city to say that names matter. It will need to learn to say other names, Missandei said. Yes, Margaery said thoughtfully, as if she were counting cups before a feast. It will. Word came, as word comes, first to those who listen hardest. A convoy out of Myr had been taken by pirates near the Stepstones. There was a possibility. It turned into a certainty when men unrolled the parchments and counted the marks, that the pirates had been told which sails to seek by men in Yunkai, who wished to show that letters would not row ships. The master of ship's man went down to the quay and shouted at pilots with more passion than wit. Missandei took the staff with the bronze head and went to the end of the boom, where the men who knew ropes stood and watched the current. She said nothing until she had listened to them talk about the way the water laid its hand on the chain today, and how yesterday the hand had been lazier. Then she said, "There's a cove east of here," and described it, and a man with old eyes nodded and said, "It is not a cove when it needs to be." And she said, "Today it needs to be." And he shrugged, which in sailors' language is a yes. A small ship left the harbor at dusk, hugging the shore in the way men do when they wish to smell the land with their eyes. It carried no banners. It looked like a bucket. It carried 3 men who could lift nets, and 1 who could lift a man with his words. Missandei did not watch it out. She watched the men on the boom and the man with old eyes and the way he scratched his cheek while not appearing to use his hands. When the ship returned at dawn with 3 men trussed like hogs in its hold, and a 4th man who had to be lifted with a caution born of the understanding that men pricked full of holes leak not only blood but information, Missandei was at the quay with a cup of water and a slate. She took names. Men lie less easily when a woman writes their names while they are telling them. The trussed men belonged to no city. The pricked man belonged to Lys, but he had been paid with coin that had the taste of Yonkai's counting houses on it, which is to say the coin had been counted 3 times by 3 different men to make sure it was theirs to give away. The pricked man was more afraid of a knife than of a pen. Missandei did not show him a knife. She wrote his name again and again, until at last he said one more thing that changed the color of the day. The pirates had been told to cut sails but not throats, because throats are witnesses and sails are statements. Men in Yunkai wanted statements. They wanted to say, "Your letters do not protect your sails." She sent that sentence to Tywin. He sent back a sentence that had more weight in it than its words. "We will answer on water," which might mean ships or might mean something like ships, numbers, alliances, the begrudged favor he had offered once and would not offer again. She sent a small bottle of wine to the men who had lifted nets and men. She went to the rookery and asked the man with clean hands for 2 minutes of time he did not have. He gave them to her because she had not asked him for time before. She wrote to Nenkatho, "Let the washing place woman sleep where there is a door that opens inland. Men in Yunkai will be busy looking at the sea." Genna and her sister left King's Landing a week later in a cart for the Reach, because it is good to go away from the place where you have been hurt, even if the new place is only a different sort of work. Margaery's maid arranged their passage with a cheerfulness that might have been called cruelty if it were not so skillful. She told the girls the exact number of loaves they would eat along the way, and the exact number of times they would have to get down to push, and this made the journey into a list, and lists can be done. Missandei stood with them while the cart's wheel was wedged with a stone and kissed each girl on the forehead as if she were a mother and as if the kiss would mark them for men to see. "These 2 are someone's." The girls waved as if they were already far away. After the cart had gone, Missandei went to the frame at the quay and found that someone had tried at night to pry out one of the nails. The wood had bled a little, as the man from Myr had said, and the parchment had curled at a corner as if it were tired of being straight. She pressed the corner back with her palm and held it until the parchment lay again. Then she took a hammer from a man whose hands were black with pitch, and put the nail back and drove it with 3 quick blows, and a 4th gentle one that set it without bruising the wood. The men at the quay watched without making it into a show. There is virtue in not applauding the right thing because it is the right thing. The days brought trials of other kinds. A knight from the Crownlands rode up with a claim that one of his men had been taken in Astapor and not returned. He was wrong. The man had been taken in Korth and sold in Marine, and had died in the pits there because his elbows were not good for holding. Missandei spoke the knight's name in the room when she told him this, and he flinched because he had not expected the woman with the ribbon to know his name. A slaver dared the quay in the open and offered boys a copper for every curse they could throw at the unsullied that would make them flinch. The boys took his copper and then used the words he paid for on the man himself until he learned that curses are like birds. They come home to their roost when you throw them at the wrong door. A priest of the 7 came down and prayed under the frame with a voice that was not fine but that made a better sound in the air than most men's talk. And Missandei listened and learned the names the priest gave to mercy and to patience, and afterward gave the priest a sack of onions and a word to carry to a house where women needed to hear. Cersei sent for her twice more. The first time to say, "If your queen comes," and Missandei said, "I have no queen here," and Cersei said, Then who taught you to stand the way you stand? And Missandei said, A woman who learned to stand alone before men began to stand with her. And Circe's mouth made a shape that would have been jealousy if it had not been edged with grief. The second time to say, You are making my father look pleased with himself. And Missandei said, If he is pleased, it is because his sums add up. And Circe said, Sums have a way of changing. And Missandei said, Only if you change what you count. And Circe said nothing because she understood counting very well and did not like to be reminded of it. Varys came as often as he dared, and sometimes when he should not have. He brought her a word from a boy who had heard another boy say that a man had said that a certain ship would come at moonless nights to a certain cove. He brought her a bit of silk with a pattern on it that, in the light, showed a sigil that could pass for another sigil. If a man wanted to convince a guard that his purse had a right to enter a gate. He brought her once a small carved wooden dragon to make her smile, and she did not, and he did not insist. You are making a city, he said one evening, as if it were a language he preferred not to speak aloud because the word itself might frighten the thing it named. It is not the city you came to make. It is the city that came to you to be made. Menderau, I am making a place where men can sell bread and not be beaten for it, Missandei said. When I have done that, I will think about cities. You will not have time, Varys said, and looked at the sea as if it were a ledger. Cities arrive while you are counting loaves. She knew he was right. She did not like it. She returned to the quay and touched the staff to the nailheads again, and made a point of watching the men coil rope. And in doing so, let them watch her watch them, which is sometimes as good as a gift. On a day when a rain that was not enough to wash anything fell and made the stones sweat, a brave Oz galley came in with hull high and oars fixed, and a man of middle years with a nose like a knife on his face and a knife like a nose at his belt came to find Missandei. He spoke the common tongue as if he were testing the edge of each word before putting it into the air. You are the woman with paper, he said. I am the woman with paper, Missandei said. I have a man with a name, he said, and gave it. Ben Butterwell of a village with a name that had been a joke on his tongue when he was young. Missandei's hand went to the ledger at her side without her mind telling it to. She wrote Ben's name once more for the pleasure of seeing ink make a path over his letters. He will come with you, the Brevosi said. He will look old to you because he has been in sun that was not his, and in the shade of men who blocked the sun as if it were theirs. He will smell like rope and like oil, and like a sort of fish you do not have a word for in your tongue. He will cry. Do not let him be ashamed. Men in my city are not ashamed to cry. It is a thing we do to keep our eyes from drowning when there is too much salt in the air. Bah. We have salt, Missandei said softly. We have eyes. The man nodded, pleased in the way of men who hear their own thought in a different voice and recognize it. He brought Ben Butterwell. Ben had shoulders that had been made to carry more than sacks. He had a line at the corner of his mouth that might have been a habit of kindness and might have been a scar. When he saw the frame and the parchment and Missandei's ribbon, he flinched as if someone had opened a shutter and let sunlight strike him full in the face. Then he put his hands to his eyes and pressed the heels of his palms into them and made the small rough sound of a Westerosi man who has been taught to keep his noises private. Missandei put a hand on his arm and felt the muscle remember how to be what it had been before it was used only for pulling. Ben Butterwell, she said. Where is your home? He told her the name, and she repeated it so he would hear it in her mouth and believe it existed in the world again. She took him by the hand, not like a child, not like a man, like a person who had a hand and another person who had a hand. She led him up the hill to a clerk who had a quill that liked to write the letters of men's lives in the king's books. She stood while Ben gave his name, and the clerk wrote it, and then miswrote it, and then wrote it properly, because Missandei had said the letters and he had been forced to listen. She stood while Tywin lifted his gaze and weighed the worth of one man, and decided that it was not worth much to him, and then put a little extra weight on the other side of the scale, so as not to look cheap. She stood while Cersei looked at Ben as if he were both an accusation and a nuisance. She stood while Varys's eyes softened in a way he could not entirely prevent. She stood while the king said, "He smells," and then unprompted, spoke the bread word she had taught him and said, "Please," and then, awkward but sincere, "Welcome," and Ben's mouth made a shape around the word welcome, as if it were bread put into it after a long time without bread. In the days that followed, more names in her ledger became men in her sight. Not all. The world does not ever allow the ledger to be balanced entirely. Some lines become lines through names. Some become circles around them because a man cannot be found and you wish to remember to look again. But enough came to make the city learn a new sound. The sound of men saying the names of places in voices that had been trained to forget them. A man whispered, "Stony Sept," as if it were the name of a woman. A woman said, "Lannisport," with bitterness and then with wonder. A boy who had forgotten the name of his own village remembered the smell of a tree in it, and from that memory, a name unfolded like a flower after rain. Missandei wrote each and put a mark beside it to indicate where the man had gone next. To the reach with the girls. To the riverlands with a trader who had a cart and preferred to share it with men who slept quietly. To the city's own kitchens, because a man who is good with knives is good with onions too, which is a fact rarely celebrated and deserving of praise. In the harbor, a ship bound for Sunspear took on water, and stories in equal measure. A man from Dorne stood on the quay, wearing a loose white garment that moved in the wind like sailcloth. He watched Missandei from under a brow that had learned to make shade for the eyes. When she came near, he said in the slow, careful comment of a man who speaks 3 other tongues more fluently, "In my country, we do not like men who sell men." "In mine, we have stopped liking them," Missandei said. "In mine, we stab them," the man said, not with pride, and not with shame. "It is a custom. Customs are not always wise, but they are comforting." He considered her ribbon. "If your woman comes." "I have no woman here," Missandei said. And yet the man smiled as if he had expected the answer and thought it worth hearing anyway. "My prince says the world is round and we pretend otherwise because corners comfort us," he said. "Your paper is a corner. It makes men feel as if they are standing in a room. Rooms are made to hold talk. Talk makes men less likely to stab one another." He shrugged in the elegant Dornish way. "This is not always good. Sometimes men need stabbing." "Sometimes," Missandei said. "I prefer bread." "Bread is good," the man said, and the two of them stood in the shade of a mast for a long moment, as if the world had arranged the day to offer them that precise sliver of relief. The understanding with King's Landing, which the city refused to call a treaty because the word sat ill in the mouths of men who feared they would have to learn to pronounce it properly, settled. It did not become law in the way that cakes become cakes when they are removed from ovens. It became habit. Men began to look for the frame when they came to the quay, not to read it, but to ease their eyes on it, the way men glance at a familiar saint as they pass and feel steadied. The Unsullied became part of the harbor's furniture, like bollards and coils of rope, and the boy who sold hot wine when the weather turned. The gold cloaks learned to stand nearer the Astapor moorings than Tywin had wanted, and farther than Missandei had demanded. A compromise that made neither side content, and therefore work. Varys men became more difficult to detect. Littlefinger's men remained exactly as detectable as he wished them to be. Yunkai did not stop. That is not what such cities do. They wrote more letters. They sent men with other men's faces. They paid for curses to be shouted, and for stones to be thrown, and for a rumor to be begun, that the woman with the ribbon had a lover in the Red Keep, and that she was a witch, and that she was a queen, and that her hair at night glowed. Missandei did not bother with these things except to keep a list, because lists can be held up and laughed at, and then set aside as if they had been dealt with. She wrote another letter to Nenkatho and told him to sleep 1 hour more, because she had learned that men who do not sleep become clumsy, and clumsy men drop papers. She wrote a letter to no one, and did not send it, in which she told Daenerys about a boy who had smelled the parchment, and a man who had said a bread word, and a woman who had pressed her palms into her eyes in the rookery and wept at last. When she finished that letter, she burned it in a small brazier and watched the smoke curl up to the slice of sky and vanish. Smoke vanishes. That is its nature. Words do not. The staff with the bronze head leaned in the corner. The ribbon around it had become less new, and therefore more hers. Outside, a mule bell tolled, and a gull cried, and somewhere above, in one of the countless rooms where the city kept its lungs and its heat, a woman sighed in her sleep. Missandei listened and did not mistake the sigh for weakness. Sighs are the body's way of adjusting to the weight it has chosen to carry. She rose before dawn the next day as she had before, and would again, and went down to the quay to stand where men would pass and see that the woman who had read the words that had been hammered to wood still stood there with her hand on the frame. A boy with scarred scalp and new shoes touched the hem of her dress and ran off. A fisherwoman with a mouth full of laughter gave her a cake for free, and then slapped the hand of the man who tried to take coin from Missandei for it. The wind came in long, disciplined breaths from the river. The city gathered itself for another day under the name it would not speak. Treaty, understanding, an agreement which men would break in small ways and keep in larger ones, because keeping it kept their cups full. The gulls rose and fell like thoughts, and Missandei, of Dene, of Astapor, of no queen and of one, set her palm to the wood and felt the nail-heads cool under her skin. There would be days when the nails pulled free. There would be days when the wood split. There would be days when the parchment was torn down, and another parchment hammered up to replace it with ink that had learned to lie more politely. She accepted this. She let acceptance be a practice, and not a resignation. She had a ledger and a staff, and a ribbon plain enough to be seen and not stared at, and a city learning to pronounce a word that was not yet in its mouth, and would be there, eventually, as naturally as bread. The sea, obedient only to the moon, and to nothing that men built on its edges, lifted its shoulders gently, and the black water carried the image of the frame in a wobble that came and went and came again. Behind her, the red keep hulked like a set of old decisions. Ahead, the ships made their names on the wind, and were known by them. Missandei breathed in the way she had learned on Eneth, when the wings went whispering through the trees. And when she breathed out, she tasted tar and river and common words, and trusted that air would continue to enter and leave her as long as she had work to do.